Thank you very much. Hopefully you can all hear me. So yeah, it's great to do this. Hello to everyone out there having your sandwiches or whatever. So I work at Strathclyde in the education enhancement team. So we do various things to help staff to improve learning and teaching around the university. The main thing that we do is a thing called Tester, where we collect, analyze, and use student feedback to help departments to improve assessment and feedback. So that's the main thing that we do. Before I came here a few years ago, I was at the Higher Education Academy, which is now Advanced HE. And there I worked on the NSS, so mainly around helping institutions to make use of the NSS from an enhancement point of view. So that's my background, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking specifically about the National Student Survey. So I'm going to be talking about making sense of surveys, specifically how to work out what the results mean. So figuring out what your survey results mean is obviously a big topic. I'm going to cover one little bit of that, which is working out whether the comparisons that you make using your NSS results are statistically significant, whether they mean something from a stats point of view, and then how you can use that idea and that mechanism as a tool for interpreting your NSS results. So as Alison said, I'm going to aim to talk for about 20 minutes. If you put questions up, I will address them if they're about something that, clarification as we're going through. Otherwise, we can have a general chat at the end. Okay, so a quick introduction. So the NSS is political and it is emotive and it makes people cross. It inspires quite polarized views. So there are people who think it can do everything. It can tell us everything we need to know, and people who think it can't do anything at all, and it's a complete waste of time. The reality is boringly in the middle. It's obviously a fantastic idea to ask students what they think about their program and their class and things like that. The NSS is just one way of doing that, and like any way of doing that, it has some strengths and weaknesses, and the weaknesses and the limitations do need to be kept in mind. It's really important that we're aware of them, but it doesn't stop the NSS being useful. So one of the issues is the statistical limitations of the NSS data. So the people are often concerned about are the results that are the data that I'm being given, the rankings and things that I'm being told to look at, are they meaningful? And that is an important question. But we can actually, so can we take the stats limitations of the NSS into account and still make use of the data? Yes, I think we can. So paying attention to the statistical limitations of the NSS does not mean that we can't use it. And the way I'm going to talk about it is by using the confidence intervals, which I shall explain in a minute. Now, I have made a fact sheet with kind of practical guidance and technical information, and you can actually get it. Alison, I might just explain. You showed me how to get it. Oh, actually, I can't. I'm not sure I can explain in any coherent manner how to get it. Alison, do you want to cut in and explain to people how to get the fact sheet in case they want to do it now?
Yeah, so if people would go down to next to the hanging up button is a button called Share Content, and if you click on that, and then you should see a Manage Content option that has a fact sheet that's downloadable.
Thank you, Alison. So it's a few pages, so don't feel you have to look at it now, but it is there with some more of the technical, practical stuff, so I don't have to cover it while I'm talking. Okay, and then just that last point on qualitative data. So I'm talking specifically about the quantitative data from the NSS, but that's not because that's the only thing that matters, or even that that's the most important thing. It's just there. So how can we use it? The qualitative data from the NSS is really important, particularly because it helps you to understand the scores, and in general, when you're making sense of your NSS results, talking to the students is key. If you want to know what your NSS scores mean, ask the students. But I'm going to be talking about what you can do with the numbers because they're there, so what can we use them for? So confidence intervals. So they represent the range in which you can be confident to a certain level that the real score falls, right? So they're publicly available from the Office for Students website. You can go there and you will see, it has it for subject groupings, JACs, and the new one, Common Aggregation Hierarchy. So for your subject level, you can see your score of whatever, 70%, and then you can also see a number above and below that, and that represents the range in which you can be. These are 95% confidence intervals. So you can be 95% confident that the real percentage agreement score falls, if you like. So it's like the margin of error. So I hope that's clear, at least a bit. So how big are the confidence intervals? So on average, so I'm talking about JAC's 3 subject levels. This is the finest grain that you can have, which is normally the most useful. So that's 106 subjects for the JAC subject grouping. So the average institutional response is 58. So that means that when you're talking about that subject level, on average, an institution has 58 students responding to the NSS. And on average, the confidence intervals are 31 percentage points. So if you have a score of 70%, on average, the confidence intervals will run from 55% to 85%. And that is the range in which you can be confident, 95% confident, that the real value falls. Okay, so that's confidence intervals. There's more on that in the fact sheet, but I'm going to be talking about how you can take account of that. You can use that data to make sense of your NSS results. Now, to do that, sadly, we need another stats concept, which is statistical significance. So when we're talking about making sense of NSS results, what we really mean is making sense of the comparisons that we make with the NSS results. If you have a score of percentage degree score of 70% for a particular question, you're not just going to stare at that number and wonder what it means. You're going to compare it with other numbers. You're going to compare your score for this year to your score for last year. You're going to compare with different institutions. That might be through a ranking system or through quartiles, but it's going to be NSS comparisons. How do we make sense of those comparisons? So one answer is to see whether the comparison that you're making is statistically significant. So if you're comparing your score with the score from say a different institution, is the difference between those two scores statistically significant? And when we say it's statistically significant, we mean we can be confident that it represents a genuine difference in students' perceptions and isn't just due to chance. Okay, so this is horribly simplified. There's more nuance and stuff in the fact sheet, but crudely speaking, if the confidence intervals don't overlap, so that's example 1 on the left, the difference is statistically significant. If the confidence intervals do overlap, that's example 2 on the right, the difference is not statistically significant. Okay, so that's a simplification, but broadly speaking, that's how you can think of it. There's more stuff in the fact sheet. Okay, and then just some caveats. So statistical significance there's been some criticism recently about people using it as a kind of be-all and end-all. It is just one way of interpreting data. It should be used alongside other stuff that you know. It shouldn't replace all your other judgment about what's meaningful and what's not. It's just a tool that you can use. And particularly that difference when you decide that something is significant or not significant, that's just information that helps you do your interpretation. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's not all that matters. It's a useful tool. You can think of it as like the pinch of salt with which to take your NSS scores. Right, so I'm going to talk about 2 ways in which you can compare your NSS results and how you can use statistical significance to help you do that and to make sense of the comparisons. Okay. So firstly, comparing results from different years. So this shows a real series of scores for a particular institution, for a particular subject, and for a particular question. Again, it's the JAC's 3 level, so that's where there's 106 subjects. So this is pretty representative. I picked it because it has about an average number of student responses for each year, which means that the confidence intervals are of an average size. It goes 2012 to 2016 because in 2017 the questions changed, so you can't really make comparisons with 2017. Okay, so what you can see is that the scores change from year to year. Some years they change a tiny amount, some years they change quite a lot. So from 2013 to 2014 there was quite a big change. All of the year to year, the confidence intervals overlap for each year, if you see what I mean. So none of those changes year to year reach the level of statistical significance. And that is actually quite representative. So on average, across all universities, all subjects, all questions, when I looked at it between 2014 and 2016, hardly any, 2% of the year-to-year comparisons are statistically significant. So you don't get very many statistically significant changes year on year in the NSS. Now that is in a sense, a good thing. It's evidence for the reliability of the survey because the scores are very stable, but it does mean that it takes quite a lot to get a statistically significant change. Now that 2% is an average. There are quite big difference between questions and between subjects. It differs between subjects because different subjects have different average cohorts. So nursing, on average, has lots and lots and lots of students responding because the cohorts are big. Other subjects, archaeology, Italian studies, have fewer students on average responding. That means that if you have more students, the confidence intervals are smaller. It also differs by question because students vary in their responses more for certain questions than for certain other questions. So if you teach nursing and you're interested in course organization and you look at your NSS scores, the chance of your score for question 15, that's on course organization, the chance of that changing from year to year is 26%. So 1 time in 4 on average, that score, the change in score is going to be statistically significant. At the other end of the spectrum, so that's one end. The other end of the spectrum, you have Italian studies, where from 2014 to 2016, across all institutions, there were no statistically significant changes from year to year for any question. Okay, so that's quite stark. So and then it differs by question. So communication skills, which is question 20. So I have improved my communication skills. Remember, this is the old NSS up to 2016. Not across all institutions, all subjects, less than 1% of the changes year on year were statistically significant. Okay. Now I will say that statistical significance, as I said, is just one ingredient in the interpretation of the results. So you may have other evidence that a change is meaningful. So there's an example I know of where there was a department that struggled with the timeliness of feedback and the students were quite negative about it. They made some big changes. They implemented concrete changes to how feedback was delivered and monitored, and the students became much more positive the next year. The scores really jumped up, but because of the size of the confidence intervals, it did not quite reach the level of statistical significance. Now, you wouldn't say that that is not a meaningful change. They have other stuff that they know that means they can conclude that that change was really meaningful and that something happened. Statistical significance is just one ingredient when you're trying to figure out whether your results mean something. But on average, it's unlikely that a score for a particular question will be statistically significantly different from last year. So firstly, the confidence intervals are important to have a look at to see what's going on really, rather than relying on just on the raw scores. But also that's a bit of a problem, right? Because getting data on the impact of enhancement activities is really key. Has it made a difference? So what can you do? So, well, firstly, yeah, if you teach nursing and you're interested in course organization or the timeliness of feedback, you have a reasonable chance of seeing significant changes because of the size of the cohort, which means the confidence intervals are small rather, and because of those particular questions, students vary more in their responses, so you're going to see bigger changes on average. Okay. Second thing, well, if you don't teach nursing, you're not interested in those things, what can you do? So maximize your response rate. So there seems to be a lot of talk about people, well, if you get a high response rate, it's more negative or more positive, or the main thing is that if you maximize your response rate, you get a clearer sense of what's going on. And in technical terms, the confidence intervals get smaller. So that means you're more likely to see statistically significant differences in general. The other thing, last bullet there, is if you're comparing against yourself, you can use your own questionnaire, right? You don't have to be limited by anything else. So the fact that the proportion of year-on-year changes that are significant, the fact that that differs by question is a clue there that how you ask the question and what you ask the question about changes the amount of variation year to year, and so but you can make it more sensitive if you like. So for instance, ask the NSS questions but with a 10-point scale instead of a 5-point scale. You're more likely to see year-on-year variation. Or ask more specific questions. There are ways that you can come up with a questionnaire that is more likely to see changes, more sensitive. The NSS is very stable, which is good for some things, not so good for others, but you can use other questionnaires. Okay, the second thing I wanted to talk about, how am I doing for time? Okay, so comparing results to the sector average. So you could compare between individual institutions, but they are not often statistically significant because so comparing between individual institutions is often you just get a lot of noise. You could use quartiles. They are sometimes helpful, sometimes not. For some questions where there isn't much variation, there's a lot of bunching, and really every one is much of a muchness, and dividing them even into quartiles, it kind of creates a bit of an illusion of difference. So what you can do is compare against the aggregate score for your subject. So that's where, say, there's an average for nursing for question 15 where all of the scores for nursing are combined into a sector average. Now the sector averages, the confidence intervals are just on the OFS website. Anyone can go there and download them along with the kind of actual percentage degree and various other bits of data. The sector averages aren't for some reason publicly available. They're provided with your internal institutional data, which made sense in the old days because internal institutional data was different from what's publicly available. But these days it's kind of the same. So I'm not quite sure why, but your surveys team within your institution will have the sector averages. So get in touch with them, see if you can get hold of them to do this kind of thing. Now the sector averages, you don't get confidence intervals with those, but it doesn't matter because there's thousands of student responses going into each sector average. So it's all of nursing averaged out. So that's thousands of responses. The confidence intervals are effectively zero anyway. Okay, so you can compare your scores against the sector average for your subject. So then you can make an institutional heat map. And here is an example of this sort of thing. So this is a real institution. I picked it to be broadly representative. So down the left-hand side are the subjects. So the rows are the subjects. Along the top are the 27 questions of the NSS. So the columns are the questions. Where the cell is green, that means that the score for that institution and that subject, that question, is statistically significantly higher than the sector average. And where it's kind of that orangey browny color, that means it's statistically significantly lower than the sector average. And where there's no color, this is ND, that means no difference. So there is no statistically significant difference from the sector average. So this is representative. So there's some reds, there's some orangey browns, there's about a quarter of the cells are colored, which is representative, that about 24% of scores differ from the sector average. So if you're looking at as a subject, say as a department, if you're looking at a particular subject and you've got 27 questions, about 6 of them are going to differ from the sector average. So this, I think, is a helpful way of presenting the data because it illustrates, well, for an institution, it's helpful. It illustrates where it might be worth investing a bit of time and effort. So if you see particular rows that are coloured, so there's a couple for this institution where you'd say, okay, there might be something interesting going on here, either problems or things that are going well. And then for an institution, if you have a pattern going down through the column, that's maybe an area where as an institution you have a particular challenge or something that's going particularly well and might reward further effort. I'm going to answer that question in a minute, just because I'm really quite close to the end, if that's okay. Right. And so the one caveat with this is that because some subjects see bigger cohorts, some on average, some rows, you're going to see more color. So some subjects like psychology there, which is the row with a lot of orange and brown, you tend to see bigger cohorts, so you're more likely to see significant differences. And again, some columns, because some questions vary more institution to institution. Question 15, question 10, these are questions where you're more likely to see color. Question 6, you're less likely to see color. Okay, so just quickly to conclude. So testing for statistical significance is quite a good way of dealing with the NSS, the volume of noise, if you like. So you get a lot of NSS numbers, you get lots of comparisons, there's lots of institutions with scores, you can create lots of rankings, lots of differences that come down to small percentage points. Using the confidence intervals to look at statistical significance can give you clearer and simpler messages, cutting out the noise from the data. Okay, but it is just one element of interpretation, shouldn't be used on its own. It should be used and people should pay attention to this stuff, but not to the exclusion of other stuff. The NSS has quite predictable strengths and weaknesses. It's a high level, as we saw, relatively stable in terms of the results, quantitative census survey. So it's really good for certain things. So if you teach, if you have a lot of students, so if you teach something like nursing where you've got tons of students and you're interested in the areas where students tend to vary more in their responses year to year and between institutions, like organisation of the course, timeliness and feedback, the NSS results are going to tell you quite a lot. If you teach a subject with smaller cohorts, so archaeology, you don't have that many students, and you're interested in something else that doesn't vary much year to year or between institutions like question 6, which is the synthesis of ideas, your NSS results are going to tell you a lot less. And in general, for smaller cohorts, you're going to be relying more on the qualitative data, talking to the students, doing focus groups. If you've got big cohorts, the NSS results can be much more useful. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and we can take some questions. So there was a question, wasn't there? Would it be inadvisable to use heat maps when looking at programs within a single institution, e.g. a survey sample of 10,000? So does that mean, do you mean if you're running your own questionnaire, if you see what I mean? Is that what you mean? Yeah, okay. It depends what the colors represent. So with this one, so the people create heat maps, which just means kind of, I guess, colored tables, for lots of different things, and they are really good ways of illustrating the data. The problem is, well, the issue is what's going in there. So this So to illustrate the point, so quartiles are often used. Now, quartiles can be really, really useful, and uh, it's something that's become quite common. But the thing to be careful with quartiles is that they're not sensitive to bunching. So there are certain questions. So, like we said, question 6, that there isn't much variation between institutions, for instance, and the same with question 27, actually, overall satisfaction. What you will see is that most institutions for most subjects are much of a muchness, right? They're all kind of around the same point. So you see this quite a lot with overall satisfaction. Kind of the students kind of just give you a sort of shrug, yes, 75% or something. So there, if you create a quartile, even though you're not separating them out by individual institution, it still may be the case that there isn't really much difference between the institutions in the bottom quartile and the institutions in the top quartile. So that's a problem with that. Yeah, 10 different colors. I mean, I think there is always a predictable balance between, I don't know what you'd call it, robustness and accessibility. So you want to make it easy for people to interpret, but you don't want to give them nonsense. So you don't want to simplify things to the point where you're missing out important information. I think there isn't a simple answer to this, that actually what you have to do is just make a decision about what you want people to know. The alternative is to give people tons and tons of data and just hope that and help them to make sense of it, which I think can work sometimes. But I mean, I like these institutional heat maps because you really are cutting through the noise. But it would be if you were just to give people this, that would be a bit extreme. But it would mean that what you're doing is you're telling departments effectively where are they particularly good or particularly bad, and you're missing out all the stuff in between. And you can make an argument for doing that, but it would be quite extreme. But that's what you would have to do. You'd have to make an actual concrete decision. I'm not sure there's a way around it. So presumably, if you're giving people 10 different colors, that's because you have that fineness of grain of information that you want to communicate, which is fine. But then if they're not going to take it in, kind of, I guess, what's the point? But I mean, it is difficult, and because of how institutions work, who's in a position to make that executive decision to simplify the message and say we're not going to give people everything, we're just going to give people specific messages through specific visualizations of the data, can sometimes be a bit tricky, I think. Okay.
Did anyone else have any questions for Alex? We've got time for a couple more if people would just like to type them into the chat box.
I'm trying to think if there's anything I didn't cover that I was desperate to cover. Not really. I suppose the one thing that I would just say is sometimes you can feel a bit vulnerable with the NSS data, because somebody else, if you're in an institution, there's a surveys team, they crunch the numbers, they give them to you, but the confidence intervals are publicly available. I mean, I just go get hold of them, and then I can paint a picture for myself of the entire sector. I can see everybody's scores, everybody's confidence intervals, analyze statistical significance stuff across the sector. So you can just go and do this and build a picture yourself. You don't have to rely on somebody else having the time to actually set aside to do it. It's not that complicated, I don't think. So in the fact sheet, there's more kind of practical guidance, but I think it's relatively straightforward to use the confidence intervals to do stuff like I've talked about. I mean, it's just making a bar chart and then sticking some error bars on and then having a look. But you can do it yourself. It's DIY, and it's not the whole picture, but it does give you some messages that can sometimes be buried under lots and lots of numbers, where you're dealing with small, like individual percentage points with year-on-year changes, and you're not quite sure what it means, well, you can actually go get the confidence intervals, stick them on, and then you can start to see patterns emerging out of the data. I just wanted to add that.